Do you think you will be acquitted?
That really doesn't enter into it too much. Every time I get anxious about what's going to happen, I think of the people in Darfur. Even if we were found guilty and given a jail sentence, compared to what they're going through, it's small potatoes.
This is not a natural disaster, and it can only partially be described as a humanitarian crisis. Nor is it the accidental byproduct of armed conflict, a massive case of collateral damage. This human destruction is intended. It is destruction growing out of racial and ethnic hatred deliberately inflamed by the National Islamic Front regime in Khartoum. The comparison of Darfur to Rwanda is appropriate both in scale and animus. This is genocide. 400,000 people have died since major conflict broke out in February 2003. 2.5 million people have been displaced in the greater humanitarian theater, including rural Darfur and eastern Chad, and over 3 million are now conflict affected. That number may soon exceed 4 million.
My name is Brenna Cussin. I'm here at the Embassy of Sudan because I believe there needs to be an end to the genocide that the government of Sudan is committing against the people in Darfur. I went to Sudan in December and witnessed firsthand the extent of the devastation. I visited 4 camps for internally displaced people. 2 of the camps, the small camps had about 5,000 people each, and the large camps had over 60,000 people.
The insurgency war in Darfur began virtually unnoticed in February 2003. It has, over the past 2 years plus, precipitated the first great episode of genocidal destruction in the 21st century.
People there didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough water, they lived in terrible conditions, all because of the violence of the government and the Janjaweed soldiers.
The victims are the African tribal groups of Darfur, primarily the 4, the Masalite, the Zagawa, but also the Tunja, the Birgit, Dajo, and others. These people have long been politically and economically marginalized, and in recent years, the regime in Khartoum has refused to control increasingly violent Arab militia raiding on African villages in Darfur. Competition between Arab and African tribal groups over the scarce primary resources in Darfur, arable land and water, has been exacerbated by advancing desertification throughout the Sahel region. But it was Khartoum's failure to respond to the desperate economic needs of the region, the decayed judiciary, the lack of political representation, and in particular the growing impunity on the part of Arab raiders that finally precipitated full-scale armed conflict.
My name is Scott Schaefer Duffy. I went to Darfur with the Catholic Worker Peace Team, which included Brenda Cousin, Grace Ritter, and Chris Dussel. We went in the first week of December. We stayed in Sudan for 9 days, and we spent 5 days in the West Sudanese province of Darfur, during which time we visited 5 camps for internally displaced people. We interviewed many members of human rights groups, Sudanese human rights groups, as well as members of humanitarian aid organizations. The purpose of our trip was threefold: was to gather information, first-hand information about the situation there; second, to deliver humanitarian aid to those who are suffering from the consequences of the ongoing genocide; and third, to look for specific ways in which we could promote nonviolent alternatives to the genocide, ways to stop the killing through our own personal action, either there in Darfur or in the capital city of Khartoum or wherever else the local people in Sudan indicated to us was a good place or a good way in which to act. During that trip, we delivered between $18,000 and $20,000 worth of food, clothing, and other assistance to individuals in the camps, as well as to organizations that work directly with the people in the camps. We observed horrific humanitarian situations, people lacking all the basic amenities: food, water, sanitation, education, clothing, proper housing, We witnessed incredible privation and flimsy security for the camps. We heard reports of people being raped gathering firewood, women being raped gathering firewood. We saw one African man being robbed of his horse by armed Janjaweed militia. In the largest camp we visited, the Kalma camp, I interviewed a mother of 7. And on a particular day, her village was attacked by the air, by the Sudanese Air Force, and bombs were dropped. Her husband was killed, and a number of other members of her village were killed. On a second day, the Sudanese military came through with jeeps with mounted machine guns and fired at random, killing more people in the village. And on the third day, Janjaweed government-sponsored militia came through on camel and horseback, killed more people, raped women, took some of the women and children hostage, essentially as slaves, poisoned the well, and burned the village. She escaped with her 7 children and walked with them for 3 days until she reached safety in the Kalma camp. Along the way, she told me that her 2-year-old daughter died of thirst in her arms. The photo that we later used in much of our press work and in a leaflet which we took to the Sudanese embassy is a photo of this woman with her surviving 6 children in the Kalma refugee camp. The second camp we visited was the Driej camp, home to about 6,000 people. This is one of the camps which the government is trying to disband. The Sudanese government realizes it has a public relations disaster and is trying to force the people in these camps to go home. But since there's no security or housing or food in their former villages, the people are insisting on remaining. One of the individuals we met there was named Mohammed, and I actually approached him as Brenna and he were having a spirited conversation. He had impeccable English. When I came up to the both of them, he was saying, "I lived my whole life in a village. Before this war, I never saw a town. And only after the government attacked us did I come close to this town. And I want to go home. I want to go back to my village, but it's not safe to go there. I need the war to stop." And he said, "I want it to stop." He said, "But I'm an African. I have no voice. They will not listen to me." And then he gestured towards Brenna and I. He said, "You have a voice. You must be my voice." I've never had anybody in a war zone be so specific in their request for us to help them.
We have to remember that many, many people in Darfur are no longer capable of agricultural production and they have no access to humanitarian aid. The Janjaweed must be disarmed. We have now a military situation which requires disarmament. Not necessarily full disarmament of small arms, but certainly all larger armaments must be stripped from the Janjaweed. There must be what has come to be called cantonment, the confining of the major Janjaweed forces in areas away from the civilians and humanitarian operations. And something that nobody's talking about, but which will be deeply consumptive of resources, military resources, protection resources, is allowing people to return to their land. This man is not alone. Everybody in these camps wants to go home. Everybody wants to go home. Nobody wants to be in a camp where there is not enough food, where there is not enough in the way of water. Water is a huge and growing problem. These water tables are being very rapidly depleted. There was a recent poll, though, conducted by the UN in a set of camps in North Darfur State. 98% of the people said they had no intention of returning home because of insecurity. If the first people to go home are attacked by the Janjaweed, and the Janjaweed just very recently burned a series of camps that were, or villages that were uninhabited, but burned them as a signal to people thinking about returning. They were in the camps, they could see the smoke. They saw their villages being... If these people return and they are attacked, if they are burned out again and return to the camps, there will be no return for the foreseeable future. People like this who want to go home absolutely must have the protection, or we will be creating permanent camps. They are already taking the shape of human warehouses.
Now, in a third instance, which is critical to our behavior later at the Sudanese embassy, we met with 2 representatives of the Sudan Council of Churches. And when we asked these people, what could we do to promote nonviolence in Darfur? Initially, they said that it's extremely important not just to do charity. They also said that when these 2 Sudanese activists had visited Darfur and stayed in a camp of internally displaced people with a relief agency. In their first night there, they heard gunfire. And the Sudanese activists wanted to go out to investigate and try to help the potential victims. But the relief workers said, no, this was a backfire from a generator. In the morning, when they investigated, though, they found 15 people dead. And the Sudanese human rights workers said the reason why the relief workers had not investigated is in order to get permits to deliver humanitarian aid, organizations have to be completely apolitical. And intervening to stop the killing is seen as political. So we asked them, well, we're not associated with any humanitarian aid group. What if our little Catholic worker peace team went to a camp and positioned ourselves at the outskirts at night to protect it from attacks from the Janjaweed and the soldiers, and positioned ourselves, interposed ourselves between the soldiers and the civilians? And the Sudanese said, you have to understand the culture of Sudan. There is an enormous culture of hospitality for strangers. And if we as internationals put ourselves in harm's way, the Sudanese would be so socially humiliated that they would stay up all night positioning themselves in front of us. And ironically, we would put them at greater risk. And we said, well, what about after we go to Darfur, if we take the information we've gleaned and then go to the presidential palace in Khartoum and demonstrate against Governor al-Bashir, General al-Bashir's government, encouraging him to stop the genocide, since he's by all accounts, the major instigator and perpetrator. The Sudanese activists again rebuffed us. They said if you held a demonstration there, it would last 5 minutes or less. You would be arrested and deported, and it would appear in no newspapers. And I said, what about Sudanese that saw it? He said they would run for fear that they would be arrested. It would have no impact whatsoever. So then we said, well, what do you suggest? And they said a demonstration at the Sudanese embassy in Washington, D.C. would be front page news in Khartoum.
My name is Tom Lewis, and on February 2nd, 2005, I went to the Sudanese embassy in Washington, D.C. with friends. There was Brenna, Scott, Harry Duchesne, Liz Fallon, Brian Kavanaugh, and Ken Hannaford Riccardi.
What was it like at the embassy when you first got there?
Well, the embassy looked a lot like the other houses near it. You wouldn't be too sure it was even an embassy. There was maybe a 25-foot walk up to it, as there was to the building next to it and the one next to it. They call it Embassy Row, so I took their word for it. And then you could start to see little symbols that made it an embassy, and the embassy next to it was the Embassy of Togo. We spread out. Some of us were up near the front stairs, some were down near the second stairs. Some of the people went inside. There was Scott and there was Brenna.
Brenna and I went inside, offered the leaflet to the receptionist and one of the other workers there, and asked to meet with embassy staff. We notified them that other members of our group were outside, holding these posters with enlarged photos of people from the camps. We made it clear that if they would meet with us, and we could reach, some concrete response that the embassy staff might introduce to help end the genocide, that this would be a satisfactory, a wonderful conclusion to the day. After 15 minutes, with no indication that they were going to meet with us, we spoke to the receptionist and said we were going to be demonstrating and praying outside for an end to the genocide. If someone wanted to meet with us and wanted to come outside and call us back in, again, that would be wonderful.
And there was a period of time when they were in there speaking with them, and we stood with our signs outside and continued to vigil. Some of those with us, Liz, Brian, and Ken were handing out leaflets. But we had talked about the possibility of blocking the entrance to the embassy and basically closing down business as usual. And we did that.
We went outside and we began a two-tiered demonstration at the top of the stairs to the embassy and the bottom of the stairs, holding our signs in an effective blockade.
And they became angrier the longer we were there. became a little less friendly, or much less friendly, as we were there longer. A group of people did try to come up the stairs, and they were not able to come up the stairs. Perhaps they could have woven their way around us, but they decided to just simply walk up the other side and climb over the railing up at the top of the embassy next to the Sudan embassy.
After about approximately 10 minutes, an embassy staff person came outside, introduced himself as Mr. Bashara. I shook his hand and greeted him in Arabic. He replied in Arabic, and I responded again in Arabic. I only know a few phrases, but it was satisfactory to have a short conversation, and he seemed quite pleased and touched that I would speak to him in Arabic. Then I told him that we were here out of love for all the Sudanese people, African and Arabic, and we were here to call for an end to the genocide, and we wanted that to stop. And he said, he responded, he said, we want the killing to stop as well. And I took his hands and I said, I believe you. He had tears welling in his eyes. I said, my father-in-law is a career diplomat for the US State Department, and I know that embassy staff people don't make government policy. They represent governments that make policy elsewhere. But nonetheless, each person that works at an embassy is an individual human being, a man, who can impact the government above them more than I could. And that we were appealing to him. Then he suggested taking both my hand and both of his, come inside. And I said, can all our group come in? And he said, yes. Unfortunately, at that moment, another embassy staff person came out and immediately refused to hold a meeting. And then they withdrew into the building, and the Secret Service arrived.
And they began to tell people if they did not move, that they would be arrested. And they were giving one warning. And then they moved around, I recall 3 of them there, and talking to different people with a similar message.
And it was at that point that Brian Kavanaugh, after the 3rd warning, knelt on the ground and began the Lord's Prayer. And I believe 2 others knelt, and the rest of us joined him in prayer. And then we were arrested, handcuffed, and taken away.
And no one resisted. They helped us up, or we stood up and walked with them to the arrest vans. They took each person individually, and they put us all in 2 vans and took us to the lockdown underneath the Capitol. After we were arrested, we were offered the opportunity to post and forfeit $50, and the case would be closed. All 7 of us refused that, and were held at the 5th Precinct, and then taken to Central Cell Block in downtown Washington, D.C., held for 24 hours, arraigned, and we were set down for trial on May 25th.
I'm here in D.C. because I'm on trial in 2 days for blockading the doors of the Embassy of the Sudan last February.
Okay. Why did you do that?
I did that because, having been in Iraq and having seen and held kids who are dying, and having heard from my friend Scott Schaefer Duffy about what was taking place in the Sudan, I felt it was necessary to come down.
Okay. And you're going on trial in 2 days?
In 2 days.
And you'll be testifying during the trial?
And I'll be testifying.
What will you be saying?
I'll be saying that I have 2 kids. 2 kids who come from other countries, 2 kids who've got medical problems and who've had every break medically and in school and with their family that anyone could possibly get. Why doesn't every kid have that same advantage?
We arrived in Washington, D.C. after a great deal of preparation on this trial and outreach to begin the trial and related trial events. We demonstrated on the 24th at the Sudanese embassy. We vigiled outside the Sudanese embassy. And then we gathered at the historic True Reformer building, where one of our witnesses spoke, Eric Reeves. And John Prendergast of the International Crisis Group also spoke. The following morning, the Jesuit community at Gonzaga High School in Washington held a mass offered for an end to genocide in Sudan. We attended that and then marched holding our placards with the victims depicted on them, and we walked in sight of the U.S. Capitol building to the courthouse. And then we vigiled outside the courthouse and we went in for the trial. The trial was roughly organized around two facets. One is a stipulation of the prosecution's case, an admission of all the physical facts. In return for this concession, the prosecutor agreed not to introduce a major fight to prevent our defense, which was an affirmative justification defense of necessity. This is an ancient doctrine, legal doctrine, which justifies the breaking of a lesser law to prevent a greater crime. And in the broad sense, we were obligated to prove three components of this defense. One, that there was an imminent, non-debatable, non-speculative harm present on that day, ostensibly for us, genocide in Sudan. Two, we had to prove that what we did to abate that harm could reasonably be considered effective. So we were bringing expert witnesses to testify to the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience in general, and specifically at embassies like the South African embassy during the apartheid years. And three, we had to bring testimony that shows that legal means were either unavailable or ineffectual to abate that harm. You can't be justified breaking a law if there was a readily available legal alternative. So we brought testimony that we contacted senators, congresspeople, that we wrote letters, that we went to Sudan, that we had tried many other things, exhausted our imaginations, put ourselves at physical risk, and even spent a great deal of money, and raised a great deal of money to try to abate this harm, and only chose civil disobedience after people in Sudan encouraged us, and after the embassy refused to meet with us. So these were our three arguments. Some of that testimony was brought by the defendants themselves, some of it brought by Dr. Eric Reeves, some of it brought by Muiza Munthali of Trans Africa, the organization which sponsored demonstrations at the South African embassy and also at the Sudanese embassy last summer, and by Dr. Mark Lance of the Peace Studies Department at Georgetown University, and Barbara Ween, the director of Peace Brigades International, as well as Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, the founder of Pax Christi and the Roman Catholic Auxiliary Bishop of Detroit.
So what's your name and what do you think of the trial so far?
My name is Brian Kavanaugh. I'm from the Harvard Catholic Worker, and I think it's going well. I think Scott planned a very organized and methodical defense, and I think most of our information has gotten in. And I think the prosecutor is down to one tactic, and that is to try to prove that we hadn't exhausted all legal means before we did the action, that we should have gone through the normal course of writing letters to our editors and writing letters to our senators and done all of the things society says you should do before we did what he considers a criminal act, even with the best of intentions, a criminal act.
And so far through the trial, though, do you think you will be acquitted?
Well, I can only speak for myself in that really doesn't enter into it too much. Every time I get anxious about what's going to happen, I think of the people in Darfur. And when you consider, even if we were found guilty and given a jail sentence, even a substantial jail sentence, I think compared to what they're going through, it's small potatoes. And I think, we'll still have an easier time of it. I would hope we get acquitted only because Scott Schaefer Duffy, our lead defense expert in this group, thinks that if we did get acquitted, it would set a precedent for further actions. It might speed up the day when things change in Darfur for the best.
My name's Ken Hannaford Riccardi, and my sentence was 20 days, 18 days suspended, 2 days for time served, 6 months 6 months on supervised probation, and $50 victim witness fee.
Did other defendants have similar similar
sentences?
Yes.
People like Scott Schaefer Duffy and Tom Lewis had a little bit more severe sentences, and people for whom it was the first time received 2 days suspended, given credit for time served, and a $50 witness fee, and no unsupervised probation.
What's your name, and what did you think of the witnesses today in court?
My name is Elizabeth Fallon. I thought the witnesses was amazing and poignant. My mom and boyfriend came, and both of them had never really thought about this issue before. However, after seeing the witnesses and hearing the testimony as to how we actually affected it, when Eric Reeves tied in all of his information to our action, and that our action was actually effective in comparison to how all these courts and things are going nowhere these days, that was powerful.
My name is Jerry Zawada. I'm a Franciscan priest from Wisconsin, and I was very fortunate to come here at this time to be present at the court and to be with all these great people, these 70 co-defendants, and they impressed me. Their witness, their articulation, their commitment, and the fact that it was a no-lose situation. That's the only way I could see it. I know that they were open to receive whatever punishment came to them or whatever results came to them. We were all hoping that they would be exonerated altogether, not have to spend any time at all. They don't have to spend time in jail, but we were hoping for no sanctions. But on the other hand, they energized the people that were in the courtroom, like myself. I felt very, very moved. I feel like I need to do something now. My knowledge of Darfur was very sketchy before coming to this courtroom. Now I feel like I need to do something to carry on their message. They are not free right now to carry on the message without severe sanctions, but I am. And so are so many people who have been in the courtroom and who I hope to tell about. We have to end genocide. That's the ultimate evil.
And so when you listen deeply to God, you can't fail to understand that God is love, and God rejects violence and hatred, and that's what Jesus came to teach us by his own words and the way he lived his life. And so if you really listen deeply to God, you're compelled to do the same kind of thing, to resist violence and to resist injustice and to try to bring peace into every situation that you can, and to prevent people from being treated with violence or with injustice, such as the refugees in Darfur. That whole thing was just terrible injustice and horrendous violence against the people.
You'd have to say, though, that in the main the world has stood silently by in the matter of genocide. If you go back to even before my time, which is a long time, think of Armenia and how it was covered up. Decades and decades. Another generation. Think of Rwanda, how easy it would have been for international interest to prevent that. People who just cared enough.
We recall that both Mr. Bush and former Secretary of State Colin Powell have formally described the human destruction in Darfur as genocide. Of Mr. Bush, we might note that he hasn't mentioned the word Darfur in over 4 months, and then only in passing. How committed, we might wonder, is the President to raising the profile of genocide in Darfur to help generate an international response? We saw a different version of this hypocrisy last September when Colin Powell declared genocide was indeed occurring in Darfur, but that, and I quote, "nothing new follows from this determination," end quote. Nothing nothing has been done to see that the primary purpose of the 1948 Convention is served: the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide.